Thomas Reed had killed 17 men over the course of 23 years, and the authorities had found evidence of exactly one. As he sits in the defendant's chair, watching his wife clutch their daughter's hand in the gallery, he feels not remorse but a quiet satisfaction. The investigators think they understand him. A single crime, a clear motive, an open and shut case. They have no idea they're staring at a master of invisibility, a man who has perfected the art of living two lives so completely that even now, facing judgment, most of his secrets remain buried in the frozen wilderness of northern Ontario.
The courtroom smelled of polished wood and faint antiseptic, a sterile aroma that should have reminded Thomas Reed of order and consequences, yet it barely penetrated the armor around him. He sat in the defendant's chair, leather cold beneath his hands, folded neatly in his lap. Around him, the gallery murmured and shifted, the shuffle of papers and quiet coughs punctuating the room. His consciousness, however, had already drifted far from the sterile reality, sinking into the labyrinth of memory and calculation. He was 48, living in a small, isolated settlement near Lake Superior, where winter snow closed roads for months and the nearest neighbors were hours away. Few could see beyond the surface: the devoted husband, the attentive father, the man who seemed ordinary in every way. Beneath that quiet exterior, decades of hidden monstrosity had been carefully constructed and meticulously maintained. The first fracture in his innocence had arrived decades ago. He was 10 when he watched his brother, trembling and silent, suffer at the hands of their stepfather. Helpless, he had felt a surge of rage so deep it burrowed into his soul, permanent as bone. That single moment had awakened something dark, dormant, yet ready, a shadow that would follow him, shaping every choice thereafter. He catalogued his victims silently, men, each encounter carefully orchestrated, each life extinguished with precision. He had learned to vanish into normalcy, to manipulate trust, to erase evidence as if it had never existed. CCTV, absent, fingerprints, wiped, witnesses, only fragments, easily dismissed. For decades, he had lived in duality, predator in the shadows, devoted father and husband at home. He bathed his daughter's hair, kissed his wife, laughed at domestic absurdities, all performance, yet authentic in its tenderness, designed to mask the darkness beneath. Tonight, only the most recent crime had drawn him here. One tiny misstep had left a trace he had overlooked, bringing him into the orbit of law enforcement. The rest, the missing men, the carefully concealed atrocities, remained undiscovered, untouched. That knowledge gave him a quiet satisfaction. His true life remained his own. He could reconstruct each moment of that crime in exquisite detail. The lure, the control, the silence that followed. Nothing had been left to chance, or so he had believed. Yet perfection was fragile. A faint fingerprint, unnoticed by him, had survived on a corner of the victim's body where his unconscious touch had brushed. That single imperfection had provided a thread for investigators to follow. He observed the courtroom, the officers, the lawyers, all oblivious to the layers beneath the surface. Their focus was on one crime, one narrative. They could not perceive the wider architecture of his darkness. They saw a man, a case, a story limited by procedure. He saw himself reflected in their assumptions, superior, untouchable in truths they could not uncover. The judge's gavel rested silently, a symbol of authority that would address only the fragment they had found. Thomas allowed his mind to drift, recalling the first screams he had silenced, the meticulous planning, the sense of invincibility that had accompanied each act. All of it traced back to that primal moment in his childhood. Life had shown him cruelty. He had embraced it, refined it, mastered it. In the courtroom, he existed as both accused and observer, detached from the drama. He catalogued evidence in his mind, analyzed investigators' moves, predicted their assumptions. Outside the room, his life continued. The wife unaware, the daughter oblivious. The quiet settlement near Lake Superior, blind to the shadows he had occupied for decades. One small imperfection had brought him here, but it did not define him. The rest, the men whose disappearances would never be explained, the darkness he carried, remained his secret. The law might see a fraction, but he held the totality. That knowledge gave him calm, even in the sterile courtroom of justice. The gavel fell, sharp against the polished wood, signaling the official opening of the session. Thomas remained motionless, hands folded, eyes calm, yet scanning the room in measured detail. The prosecution began their narrative, laying out the investigation that had ensnared him. They spoke of timelines, forensic examinations, and evidence carefully collected across the northern towns of Thunder Bay and Marathon. Thomas listened, cataloging each word, analyzing every assumption, every subtle overstatement or hesitation. To the courtroom, the case seemed airtight, a triumph of meticulous investigation. To him, it was a partial story, a thread of truth exposed while the wider tapestry remained concealed. One small fingerprint, barely visible, left where he had brushed unconsciously against the victim, had been enough to bring him under scrutiny, yet it revealed nothing of the vast scope of his actions. The prosecution described the meticulous reconstruction of the victim's final hours. They detailed the discovery of the fingerprint, the collection of samples, the cross-referencing with databases. Thomas traced their logic step by step, noting both precision and gaps. They could only see what existed in physical evidence. They could not detect the patterns he had woven across years, the men who had vanished without a trace, the silent orchestration of disappearances that stretched from Kenora to Marathon. As witnesses were called, Thomas observed their every movement, an officer's posture, a subtle hesitation in testimony, the precise choice of words, each element catalogued in his mind. He imagined the assumptions they made about him, their conclusions about his character, their expectation of guilt or remorse. They were blind to the scale of his actions, blind to the methodical patience, blind to the dual life he had maintained, predator and father, orchestrator and neighbor, hidden in plain sight. He allowed himself a faint, private satisfaction. One tiny imperfection had tethered him to this courtroom, but it did not define him. The broader truth, the network of vanished men, the carefully concealed acts, the long pattern of control, remained untouchable. He had survived scrutiny for decades, and even now, one exposed thread was minor compared to the vast architecture of his hidden life. The gallery shifted slightly as the prosecution continued, emphasizing the terror of the victim and the precision of the crime scene. Thomas noted every expression, the fear in family members, the curiosity in onlookers, the professionalism in law enforcement officers. None perceived the full picture. None could. The law could address only the tangible, the provable, the fragment of truth represented by a single fingerprint. The rest was beyond reach, preserved by his meticulous planning. In quiet moments between testimony, Thomas's thoughts wandered to the mechanics of concealment. Every step he had taken, Every precaution, every methodical wipe of evidence had been calculated. Only the unconscious slip, the imperceptible brush of a hand, had betrayed him. He catalogued the investigator's movements, the forensic methods, the courtroom procedures, and found them predictable, constrained, limited by rules they could not bend. The duality of his life, darkness in isolation, tenderness at home, remained intact in his mind. The courtroom was a temporary stage, a minor disruption in the vast continuum of his existence. One exposed crime, one misstep, one thread caught, but the pattern remained unbroken. Thomas leaned slightly back, eyes scanning the ceiling as if above it, floating beyond the reach of law, beyond the gaze of spectators, beyond the perception of everyone present. He remained calm. He remained composed. One fingerprint, one revealed crime, one thread of evidence, but the vast network of shadows, the hidden lives erased, the silent mastery of decades, all remained untouched, inviolate, entirely his own. The courtroom remained a cage of polished wood and muted murmurs, yet Thomas's mind drifted seamlessly beyond its walls. He observed the prosecution, laying out evidence, the judge scanning documents, lawyers exchanging notes, yet simultaneously his thoughts returned to the home he had crafted with painstaking care in Marathon, perched near the frozen shores of Lake Superior. He pictured the small log cabin, smoke curling from the chimney in winter, the soft glow of evening through curtained windows. Inside, he moved with a calm precision that few could imagine. He bathed his daughter's hair, untangling every strand with patient care, her laughter echoing in the room. He listened intently to her stories of school and friends, his eyes lighting with warmth, fully present in the moment. His wife prepared dinner beside him, unaware that beneath the ordinary rhythms of domestic life, a darker world existed, a hidden life that had remained untouched for decades. In the small northern community, Thomas was equally ordinary, and that ordinariness was a mask of perfection. Neighbors saw him chopping firewood, helping at the local general store, offering a quiet smile at town gatherings. He attended community events with measured enthusiasm, always polite, always dependable. His reputation was impeccable. Nobody could imagine the private darkness he carried. His devotion to family and community created an almost blinding facade. Even in the courtroom, these reflections offered him a quiet satisfaction. The duality of his life, tender father and husband, respected community member, orchestrator of death in secret, was maintained flawlessly. One misstep had brought him under scrutiny, yet the core of his hidden life, the careful architecture of secrets and disappearances, remained untouched. He remembered moments at home, preparing pancakes for his daughter, adjusting the small shelves in her bedroom, listening to her soft questions about the world with genuine patience. He recalled the small joys of community life, helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, attending the Saturday farmers market in Marathon, chatting with acquaintances on the frozen dock along Lake Superior. Each interaction required subtle calibration, a performance balanced with authentic warmth. In his mind, he analyzed these moments as meticulously as he analyzed evidence in the courtroom. Each gesture, each word, each smile was part of a broader pattern of concealment. Yet it was also real. His daughter's laughter, his wife's trust, the respect of neighbors, they were truths that grounded him in humanity even as he carried the weight of his darker impulses. The contrast was intoxicating. Absolute devotion alongside absolute secrecy. Back in the courtroom, Thomas remained composed. He observed the jury, the prosecution, the defense, cataloging every glance, every gesture, every tone. The fingerprint that had exposed him was a minor flaw in an otherwise flawless life of concealment. But even that imperfection did not define him. His domestic life, his community interactions, and his mastery of normalcy remained intact. He had crafted a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary, a life that allowed him to live in two worlds at once, one observed by law and society, the other hidden and untouchable. As testimony continued, he allowed himself a faint, private satisfaction. The court could see the fragment of his reality tied to the recent crime. They could analyze the evidence, call witnesses, and dissect the timeline. But the vastness of his hidden existence, the devotion he maintained at home and in his community, remained beyond their perception. One misstep had tethered him here, yes, but it did not dismantle the intricate, carefully balanced life he had created. Thomas leaned back slightly, watching the judge review documents, observing the lawyers debating technicalities. He could feel the pulse of the courtroom, the tension, the anticipation, but he also felt the calm certainty of control. His family awaited him at home, the frozen roads and northern forests providing both sanctuary and camouflage. The life he had nurtured, the devotion he had shown, and the community trust he had earned. These were all untouchable by law, safe in the reality he had so carefully curated. He remained as he always had, composed, devoted, invisible in plain sight, and entirely in command of the dual existence that had allowed him to survive for decades. Even as the judge called the court to order, Thomas's mind had already slipped away from the polished wood and murmuring gallery. His thoughts drifted back to the most recent act, the crime that had brought him here. Every detail replayed with the precision of a memory etched into muscle and mind, a choreography perfected over years. He recalled the careful selection of the victim, a man who had seemed ordinary, trusting, a presence easily manipulated. Observing him in the town of Marathon, noting habits, routes, and routines, Thomas had calculated the precise moment when control could be established. Every encounter was staged with subtlety, a casual greeting, a conversation designed to gauge reactions, the slow weaving of trust. He remembered the thrill of invisibility, the satisfaction of planning a trajectory that left no trace. The isolation of the final location had been essential. He had chosen a remote stretch of forest outside town, near the frozen expanse of Lake Superior, where no witness could stumble upon the scene and no stray surveillance existed. Every step, every gesture had been rehearsed in his mind countless times, a meticulous blueprint he had followed without hesitation. He remembered luring the victim, the practiced calm in his voice, the subtle gestures that prompted compliance without resistance. Each movement was controlled, each reaction predicted. There was no chaos, no improvisation, only the quiet, precise unfolding of a plan honed over decades. The victim had trusted him, unknowingly stepping into the space he had prepared, the trap set with care and patience. The act itself was methodical. Thomas recalled the moment when control became absolute, when the final sequence of decisions, the execution, the silencing, was carried out. He catalogued every sensory detail, the sound of the forest floor beneath their feet, the faint shift of air, the subtle movements that indicated compliance or panic. Every touch, every motion was deliberate, orchestrated with precision. Even after the act, Thomas maintained control. He ensured no fingerprints remained, wiping surfaces, cleaning tools, erasing traces that could betray him. Yet one unconscious touch, a slip so minor it had seemed irrelevant at the time, left a single, partial fingerprint on the victim, imperceptible to him in the moment, but sufficient to draw investigators into the web he had spun. In the courtroom, he reflected on the irony, the meticulous planning, the patient observation, the controlled execution, all undone by a trivial, unconscious error. And yet he catalogued the investigators' response with fascination. Their methodical procedures, their assumptions, the blind spots in their reasoning. They saw only the thread exposed by the fingerprint. The broader pattern, the network of vanished men, remained untouched, invisible to their perception. Thomas allowed himself a brief internal acknowledgement of mastery. He had committed the act with precision, calm, and control. Every step followed a logic of observation and anticipation. The thrill had come not from cruelty alone, but from the power of invisibility, the satisfaction of manipulating life and death with methodical precision. Even now, as the courtroom focused on one thread, the remainder of his orchestration remained intact, hidden beneath layers of preparation and secrecy. He returned to the present with ease, composed on the polished bench, fingers resting lightly on his lap. To the jury, to the judge, to the prosecution, he was merely a man facing the consequences of one crime. But in his mind, the act was complete, catalogued, and unbroken. One fingerprint had tethered him to scrutiny, yes, but it had not undone the planning, the control, or the precision that had defined the act from the first moment of observation to the final detail of concealment. The courtroom pressed forward, yet Thomas remained detached, observing the human reactions around him with a calm amusement. He had committed the last crime, controlled it entirely, and survived it with a single flaw exposed. One thread, one act, one victory partially revealed, the rest of the web untouched. And in that control, he remained masterful, composed, and utterly untouchable in the world that had no idea of the depths beneath the surface. The courtroom seemed to breathe with a quiet, almost suffocating intensity. Every polished wooden surface reflected the flickering light, casting shadows that made the walls seem closer, pressing in. Thomas Reed sat perfectly still, hands folded, the leather of his chair cold and unyielding beneath him. His mind, however, drifted far from the formalities around him. He saw Marianne's face in his mind, her worry barely concealed by a veneer of composure. He thought of the soft way she brushed her hair from Lily's face that morning, the gentle murmur she had whispered into their daughter's ear to keep her calm. He felt a pang of something almost like guilt, though it was fleeting, quickly replaced by the cold satisfaction of having hidden his other crimes so perfectly. They would never know the extent of the darkness he carried. They would only see him through the lens of this single crime, the one that had slipped through his otherwise flawless control. Across the gallery, neighbors shifted in their seats, murmuring quietly. Some had raised an eyebrow when Thomas and his family moved to the remote town a few years back. He had been helpful, quiet, reliable, a man who mowed lawns, fixed fences, and never drew attention. And yet beneath that ordinary facade, a meticulous mind had orchestrated horrors they would never suspect. He allowed himself a fleeting, imperceptible smile. The secret was his, and it would remain his. The prosecutor's voice broke through his reverie, steady and deliberate. The defendant is charged with the murder of Alison Price. Other missing persons have been reported in connection with him. However, there is no admissible evidence linking him to those cases. Today, we deal only with the crime that led to his apprehension. Thomas's gaze flicked briefly to the jury. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and wariness, but none of them could imagine the full spectrum of his past. Other cases, other disappearances, all carefully erased. He had planned every step, every misdirection, leaving nothing that could be traced back to him. The judge entered, robes flowing, the gavel heavy in anticipation of its first strike. Thomas felt the weight of reality pressing down, grounding him after his mind had wandered through memories both innocent and horrifying. He thought of Marianne and Lily again. They did not know. They could never know. Yet, in that moment, he allowed himself a fragment of warmth. He had provided for them, protected them from the shadows he cast on the world. He had loved them in his own way, though it was a love entwined with deception. Marianne leaned forward slightly, whispering something to Lily, brushing her hair back from the child's forehead. Lily's small hand twined with her mother's, offering silent comfort. Thomas's chest tightened at the sight. He had built a life that seemed ordinary, and yet the foundations were built on darkness. He wondered, not for the first time, if he could feel any remorse, any true human vulnerability. Perhaps not. But this moment, made him almost human, almost exposed. The neighbors, too, watched intently. Faces that once smiled in casual greetings now bore subtle suspicion. Had they truly known him? Could the quiet, helpful man of the neighborhood ever be reconciled with the cold calculation behind his eyes? Thomas imagined their thoughts, small seeds of doubt and fear taking root, and felt a faint thrill. Even here, in the public eye, he maintained control over what was seen and what remained hidden. The judge's gavel fell at last. Thomas's eyes returned fully to the courtroom, the present snapping him back from his internal world. Evidence had been presented, timelines, forensic analysis, witness statements, but nothing could touch the other lives he had erased, the other secrets carefully buried. Only this moment, this verdict, was real. He felt the slow tightening of anticipation, a calculated detachment mingling with the rare, unguarded tension that only came when the law intersected with his life. Marianne's hand trembled slightly against Lily's. The neighbors leaned forward, collectively holding their breath. Thomas's mind wandered one last time, tracing the invisible threads that connected him to the people he loved and the community he had deceived. He would endure this moment. He would face this one crime, and the rest would remain shadows, secrets sealed in the darkness of his mind. The courtroom waited, hushed, for the words that would decide the next chapter of Thomas Reed's life. And yet, in that quiet pause, he felt the curious duality of existence, a devoted husband and father before the world, a man who had orchestrated horrors unseen, hidden untouched, behind the ordinary mask he wore so carefully.